I never thought a single sentence could make the world tilt on its axis. But it did. The phone felt cold and heavy in my hand, a dead weight pressed against my ear as I listened to the cheerful, lilting voice of my daughter-in-law, Danny. I'd called to speak to my son, Mark, just a simple question about the timing for the wedding this weekend. I had it all planned: the drive from my small house here in Columbus to the courthouse in Cleveland, the hotel I'd booked, the gift I'd wrapped, all the small, happy logistics of a mother about to watch her only child get married. Mark didn't pick up. Danny did. "Oh, Evelyn, hi," she'd chirped, her voice bright with a practiced sweetness that always set my teeth on edge. "Mark's just in the shower. Can I help with anything?" "I was just calling to confirm the time on Saturday, dear," I said, my own voice warm, genuine. "I want to make sure I'm not late." There was a tiny pause on the other end of the line, just a beat of silence. In that fraction of a second, a strange, cold dread pooled in my stomach. Then came her laugh, a light, airy sound that was completely disconnected from the words that followed. "Oh, we got married yesterday," she said, as casually as if she were telling me they'd tried a new restaurant. "We decided to keep it simple. We only invited special guests." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the roaring in my ears, the sudden, violent thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Special guests. The two words echoed in the hollow space that had just been carved out of my chest. They ricocheted around my mind, each repetition a fresh blow. I, Evelyn Brooks, the woman who had spent the last 3 years keeping them afloat, was not a special guest. I was not even a guest at all. I was nothing. An afterthought. A problem that had been neatly solved by my exclusion. I don't remember how the call ended. I think I might have mumbled something, a congratulations, perhaps. A lie. My body moved on autopilot, my hand placing the phone back in its cradle with a soft, final click. For a long moment, I just stood in the middle of my quiet living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, striping the carpet in bars of light and shadow. My house, the house I'd lived in for 40 years, suddenly felt like a stranger's. My feet carried me, stiffly, down the hall to my bedroom closet. I didn't need to turn on the light. I knew exactly where it was. Hanging in a protective plastic sheath, pristine and waiting, was the navy dress. It was a beautiful thing, made of a soft, flowing silk that whispered when it moved. I'd spent more than I should have on it, but I'd told myself it was worth it. A mother should look her best at her son's wedding. Beside it, on the floor, sat the box with the matching heels. Low, sensible, but elegant. They were still stuffed with tissue paper. They would remain that way now. They were relics of an event that, for me, had never happened. The dress wasn't a symbol of celebration anymore. It was a shroud for a relationship I had just realized was already dead. I closed the closet door, the soft click echoing the sound of the phone call. My gaze drifted to the small writing desk in the corner of my living room. Propped up against a stack of mail was the wedding card. It had a simple, elegant design, 2 gold rings intertwined. Inside, my handwriting filled the space with words of love, of hope for their future, of pride in the man my son had become. A check for a sum that had made my savings account ache was tucked neatly inside. All that love, all those wishes, sitting uselessly on my desk. Unsent, unwanted. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. The card seemed to mock me. Who was I writing to? The son I thought I knew, or the man who let his wife tell his mother she wasn't special enough to see him married? The daughter-in-law who smiled and took my money, or the woman who saw me as an obligation to be managed? I had poured my heart, my time, and my dwindling retirement fund into their lives, believing I was building something, contributing to a foundation of family. I saw now that I was mistaken. I wasn't a cornerstone of their family. I was their silent, invisible ATM. My hands, which had been trembling, slowly grew still. The hot, Stinging tears I felt welling behind my eyes receded, replaced by something cold and hard. The shock was beginning to wear off, the raw pain of the wound starting to cool and harden into something else entirely. It was the birth of a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Donnie's words, meant to dismiss me, to put me quietly in my place on the periphery of their lives, had done something else entirely. They had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for decades, the part of me that knew the difference between being kind and being a fool. They thought I would just accept this. They thought the quiet, helpful, ever-giving Evelyn would absorb this hurt, cry her silent tears, and then show up with another check the next time they called. They had made a terrible mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Not anymore. The silence in my house was a physical presence. It pressed in on me, amplifying the frantic rhythm of my own thoughts. The navy dress was back in its sheath, the wedding card was now tucked into a drawer, out of sight but not out of mind. Out of mind? No, it was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. Special guests. The phrase had become a mantra of my own personal hell, each word a steady, rhythmic blow against the thinning walls of my composure. The initial shock, that cold, paralyzing numbness, was beginning to thaw, and what flooded in to take its place was the burning, agonizing shame of memory. My mind, unbidden, began to play the highlight reel of my own foolishness, a tragicomedy in which I was the star, the producer, and the sole audience member. It started 3 years ago. The phone call had been late, Mark's voice a carefully modulated blend of excitement and anxiety. He and Donnie had found the perfect apartment. It was a little more than they could afford, he'd admitted, but the opportunity was just too good to pass up. "It's an investment in our future, Mom," he'd said, and I, desperate to believe in that future, had swallowed the bait whole. I'd gone to my bank the next day and withdrawn enough for the security deposit and 2 months' rent, my hand shaking slightly as I signed the slip. It felt like a monumental sum, a significant chunk of the nest egg my late husband, Richard, and I had so carefully built. But as I handed the cashier's check to Mark, and he'd wrapped me in a brief, grateful hug, I told myself it was worth it. This was what mothers did. They built bridges for their children to walk across. That bridge, I now realized, had become a one-way street, with a toll that only I was expected to pay. The rent became a monthly affair. The calls would start casually, a few minutes of small talk before the inevitable pivot. "Things are just a little tight this month, Mom." Donnie's hours got cut back. The car needed new tires. Each month a new reason, a new verse to the same sad song. I would sigh, open my checkbook, and write the check, my own budget tightening like a noose around my neck. And it wasn't just the rent. I remembered the day we'd gone furniture shopping for their perfect apartment. I had envisioned sturdy, sensible pieces from a local store. Danny had steered us into a high-end boutique where the price tags made my vision swim. She'd fallen in love with a sprawling, cream-colored sectional sofa that cost more than my first car. "Oh, Evelyn, isn't it a dream?" she'd sighed, running a manicured hand over the fabric. "It would just make the whole place feel like a real home." My son had stood by, silent, a passive accomplice. I'd looked at his hopeful face, at her expectant one, and the word no had died on my lips. I paid for it. I paid for the matching armchair, the ridiculously overpriced coffee table, and the dining set they used twice a year. I even paid for the delivery, and when the delivery men refused to carry the sofa up the 3 flights of stairs, it was I who had helped my son wrestle the monstrous thing up to their apartment. My 70-year-old back screaming in protest. They had thanked me with a glass of lukewarm tap water. The steady bleed continued, month after month, year after year. Groceries. Gas money wired directly to Mark's account. Personal expenses, for Donnie a vague category that I later suspected covered designer handbags and spa days. I was a line item in their budget, the invisible, reliable source of funding that made their lifestyle possible. Each time I wrote a check or authorized a transfer, a small piece of me withered. I was funding a life I wasn't a part of. I saw the pictures they posted online, expensive dinners, weekend trips to wine country, concerts with friends. I was never invited. I was the silent sponsor, the ghost in their financial machine. And now, the wedding. We only invited special guests. A toxic curiosity, a desperate need to see the proof of my own erasure, compelled me. My hands trembled as I picked up my tablet, the screen cold to the touch. I rarely used it for more than reading the news, but I knew how to find what I was looking for. I opened the browser and typed her name into the Instagram search bar. Her profile was public. Of course it was. Their whole life was a performance. The profile picture showed her and Mark, beaming, their heads tilted together in a perfect portrait of manufactured happiness. And there it was, the most recent post, uploaded just 18 hours ago. My breath caught in my throat. It was a photograph. A collection of them, actually, in a single post you could swipe through. The first was of Mark and Donnie on the steps of a stately old building I recognized as the Cuyahoga County Courthouse in Cleveland. She was in a chic, short white dress, holding a small bouquet. He was in a sharp blue suit, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. They looked happy. Radiant, even. But it wasn't their happiness that felt like a dagger in my heart. It was the people surrounding them. There, to Donnie's right, were her parents, beaming with pride. Her mother, a woman I'd met only twice, had her arm linked through Donnie's. Her father had a hand on Mark's shoulder. Flanking them were Donnie's two younger sisters and her older brother. The entire Carter clan. They were all there, smiling, laughing, celebrating. They were all dressed beautifully. This hadn't been a spontaneous, last-minute decision. This had been planned, they had all known. They had driven to Cleveland, gotten dressed up, taken pictures, and celebrated the union of my son, and not one of them had thought to tell me. Not one of them had thought I belonged there. I swiped to the next photo. A candid shot of the group toasting with champagne flutes. Then another, of Donnie and her mother, their faces close together, sharing a secret smile. And another, of Mark with Danny's father, shaking hands like old friends. Each image was a fresh wound. I was not just excluded, I was replaced. They had created a new family, a complete set, and I was simply not in the picture. The caption beneath the photos was the final, brutal twist of the knife. Surprise? So excited to start our forever with our nearest and dearest. The best is yet to come. Number hitched, number courthouse wedding, number family first. Family first. The hypocrisy of it stole the air from my lungs. I sank back into my armchair, the tablet falling into my lap. The hurt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. The years of sacrifice, of biting my tongue, of writing checks while my own savings dwindled, it all coalesced into this one, crystalline moment of perfect, devastating clarity. I had not been helping my son. I had been enabling a stranger. I had not been building a foundation for their family. I had been a utility they exploited. I wasn't a mother in their eyes. I was a function, an ATM that never required a PIN, an easy mark who confused payment with love. And in that moment, sitting alone in my quiet, sun-drenched living room, the profound, soul-deep hurt began to change. It was a slow, chemical reaction. The sorrow began to curdle, the grief began to sour. The tears that had threatened to fall now felt like a distant memory, evaporated by a sudden, rising heat in my chest. It was the slow, steady burn of anger. A cold, clear, and righteous fury began to take root where the pain had been. It wasn't the volatile anger of a screaming match. It was something far more dangerous. It was the quiet, calculating anger of a woman who had finally been pushed too far. The woman who had given everything and had been told, in return, that she was not special. The woman who had just realized that the game was rigged, and she had been the only one not playing. I picked up the tablet again, my fingers no longer trembling. I looked at the smiling faces in the photograph, at my son and his new, complete family. They looked so happy, so secure, so utterly unaware of the earthquake they had just triggered. They had made their decision. They had drawn their line in the sand, and now, I would draw mine. The week that followed was the quietest of my life. The fury that had taken root in my living room didn't manifest in slammed doors or shouted words into an empty house. It settled deep within me, a cold, dense core of certainty. The world, which had felt gray and washed out in the immediate aftermath of Danny's call, now seemed sharp and painfully clear, as if a film had been wiped from my eyes. I saw the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, heard the groan of the house settling, felt the warmth of my coffee cup in my hands with a clarity that had been missing for years. For 3 years, I had lived in a fog of obligation, my days structured around their needs, my thoughts clouded by a constant, low-grade anxiety about their well-being. Now, the fog was gone. I spent that week in a state of deliberate, patient observation. I did not call them. I did not text. I simply waited. I knew, with the unshakable certainty of a person who has studied a pattern for years, that the silence was temporary. Their lives, the comfortable, curated existence I had so foolishly financed, ran on a schedule. The first of the month was approaching. The rent, a payment I had made as reliably as the sunrise for 36 consecutive months, would soon be due. My phone, which had once been a lifeline I clutched in hopes of connection, now sat on the kitchen counter like an unexploded ordnance. I regarded it with a cool detachment. It was no longer a tool for them to summon me, it was a trigger, and my finger was finally, and firmly, off it. Each day, I expected the call. Each day that passed without it, my resolve hardened. I imagined them in their overpriced apartment, surrounded by the furniture I bought, eating the food I paid for, perhaps laughing about the quaint, simple ceremony they'd had with their real family. I wondered if my name had even come up. Perhaps they'd decided to give me the silent treatment, a childish punishment for a crime I had not committed, believing it would bring me to heel, make me come crawling back with apologies and an open checkbook. The old Evelyn would have. The old Evelyn would have been sick with worry, replaying every conversation, blaming herself, convincing herself that a small slight was worth enduring for the sake of family. But the old Evelyn was gone. She had died on the phone with Donnie. In her place was a woman who was methodically, and calmly, preparing for battle. The call came exactly 1 week after the wedding photos appeared online. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when the phone began to ring. The shrill, electronic sound sliced through the peaceful quiet of my home. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs, not from fear, but from anticipation. I walked over to the counter and looked at the screen. Donnie Carter. Of course. Mark, my son, was a coward. He had always been one to avoid direct confrontation, preferring to let others do the difficult work. Donnie was his mouthpiece, his enforcer, the one who wasn't afraid to ask for what they wanted. I let it ring 3 more times, a small, deliberate act of control. Then, I took a slow, steadying breath and answered, my voice even and calm. Hello? Evelyn? Finally, she said. The practiced sweetness was gone, replaced by a sharp edge of frantic impatience. I've been trying to reach you. Didn't you get me texts? I had, of course, seen the notifications pop up, brief, demanding little messages that I had ignored. I've been busy, I said simply. It wasn't a lie. I had been busy reclaiming my own mind. Well, listen, I don't have time for games, she snapped, all pretense of politeness vanishing in a puff of entitled smoke. The landlord just left, he's being a complete nightmare. The rent is overdue, and he's talking about starting the eviction process. He gave us a 3-day notice. I said nothing. I let her words hang in the air between us, a toxic cloud of her own making. In that silence, I pictured the apartment, the cream-colored sectional sofa, the granite countertops they'd insisted on, the walk-in closet filled with clothes I had no doubt helped purchase. I pictured the Instagram post, the smiling faces, The champagne flutes, the hashtag, number family first. The eviction notice wasn't a tragedy befalling a struggling young couple. It was a simple, predictable consequence. It was the bill for their choices finally coming due. Her voice rose in pitch when I didn't immediately respond with a flurry of placating promises. Evelyn, did you hear me? He's going to kick us out. We'll be on the street. Mark is freaking out. I could hear the calculated panic in her voice, the well-rehearsed script of impending doom that had worked so flawlessly for 3 years. She was pushing all the usual buttons, expecting the usual response. A worried gasp, a promise to wire the money immediately, a frantic assurance that everything would be okay. She was waiting for the ATM to dispense the cash. I took another slow breath, the silence stretching, making her more and more agitated. I could almost feel her frustration vibrating through the phone. Evelyn, for God's sake, say something. She practically shrieked. And so I did. My voice, when it came, was unnaturally calm. It was not angry. It was not sarcastic. It was the voice of a woman stating a simple, unalterable fact. It was the voice of the end of an era. I'm sorry to hear that, Dani, I said, the words clear and precise. But I'm afraid I can't help you. I paused for a beat, letting the first part of the sentence land. Then, I delivered the final, fatal blow. I only help special guests. The silence that followed was a thing of beauty. It was absolute. It was a deafening, static-filled void where all her bluster and entitlement had just been. I could picture her on the other end, her mouth open, her perfectly constructed world crashing down around her ears. The invincible confidence of the bully who has just been punched in the nose. What? She finally stammered, the single word a weak, pathetic puff of disbelief. What? What does that even mean? She genuinely couldn't comprehend it. The words didn't compute. The system had malfunctioned. The machine was refusing to pay out. I think you heard me, I said, still in that same, level tone. I offered no further explanation. I felt no need to argue, to justify, to list my grievances. The power in that moment was absolute. I had said everything that needed to be said. Goodbye, Dani. I pressed the red icon on my screen, ending the call. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the cool surface. The power shift was a palpable thing, a change in the atmospheric pressure of my own home. I had not raised my voice. I had not wept. I had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, I had detonated a bomb in the center of their lives. Less than 10 seconds later, the phone began to buzz. A text message. Then another. And another. I calmly picked it up and turned it over. The screen was a rapid-fire cascade of Mark's panic, a digital nervous breakdown happening in real time. Mom? What was that about? Call me. Dani is crying. She said you said something weird. The rent is seriously overdue. This isn't funny. Mom, please answer. The landlord is a monster. We're going to be evicted. Is this because of the wedding? We can explain. This is unbelievable. After everything we do for you? You can't just cut us off. Pick up the phone. I read the last message twice. After everything we do for you? The delusion was so profound, so complete, it was almost breathtaking. They had successfully inverted reality in their own minds, reframing their constant, parasitic draining of my resources as some kind of favor to me. I had not been their benefactor. In their world, I had been their burden, and their acceptance of my money was an act of charity on their part. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I looked at my son's frantic, misspelled words on the screen. The pleading, the threats, the clumsy attempts at guilt-tripping. It was all so transparent now, so pathetic. My thumb hovered over the power button on the side of the phone. With a soft click, the screen went black. The buzzing stopped. The frantic, demanding voices were silenced. The pipeline was officially closed. In the profound and sudden silence, I took the first deep, untroubled breath I had taken in 3 years. The first no had been spoken, and in its echo, I found the beginning of my freedom. The silence that followed the silencing of my phone was profound. It was a physical entity, a weighted blanket settling over my house, muffling the sharp edges of the world. For the first hour, I did nothing. I simply sat at my kitchen table, my hand still resting on the smooth, dark screen of the phone, and let the quiet seep into my bones. It was not an empty quiet, it was a full one. It was the absence of demand, the cessation of expectation, the end of the low, humming frequency of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life for 3 years. In that silence, for the first time, I could hear myself think. And the first thought that rose, cold and clear from the depths of my newfound resolve, was a question. What did it cost? I wasn't thinking about the emotional toll. Not yet, that was a chasm too wide and deep to contemplate in this fragile new beginning. I meant it literally. What was the price tag of my own blindness? What was the exact, quantifiable cost of the love I thought I was giving, but which they were only ever taking? The question became an obsession, a necessary anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. To know the number was to know the scale of my own folly. It was to build a wall of hard, undeniable fact against the inevitable tide of guilt and second-guessing that I knew would come. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were a detective beginning an investigation. I walked from the kitchen to the small study where I kept my records. I pulled out my old checkbook registers, the ones with their thin carbon copy pages. I retrieved the folder of bank statements I'd printed out each month, a habit my late husband Richard had instilled in me. I found a fresh legal pad, yellow, lined, pristine, and a black felt tip pen that made a satisfying, scratchy sound against the paper. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the room, and I began to count. I started with the most obvious, the most consistent drain, the rent. My own handwriting, a neat, careful cursive, marched down the pages of the register. Month after month, the same entry, Mark and Danny Carter, rent. The amount was always the same, $900. I had told myself, in the beginning, that it was just to help them get on their feet. A temporary measure, a loving boost. I looked at the date on the first check. 3 years ago. 36 months. My hand was steady as I did the multiplication on a small calculator. $900 times 36. $32,400. The number sat starkly on the yellow page. $32,400. Just for rent. The foundation of their life, built entirely with the stones of my own financial security. The pen scratched on. Next, the furniture. I didn't have a receipt for the monstrous cream-colored sofa, but the charge was seared into my memory, a 4-figure wound on my credit card statement from that year. I wrote it down. Then the dining set. The coffee table. The expensive mattress Donnie had insisted was essential for her bad back. I remembered the day she'd called about that, her voice laced with a pathetic, dramatic sigh. Oh, Evelyn, I barely slept a wink. This old mattress is just killing me. And I, like a fool, had pictured her in pain and had given her my credit card number over the phone. I added the numbers, another 5,000, at least. Then came the harder part, the incidentals, the death by 1,000 cuts. I paged through the bank statements, my finger tracing the lines of withdrawals and transfers. Zelle payment to Mark Gardner, $150. Note, gas money, Venmo to Danny Carter, $200. Note, groceries. These happened weekly, sometimes more. It was a steady, relentless drip, so small in the moment that I'd barely registered it, telling myself it was what family did. But now, laid out in black and white, the drip became a flood. I estimated conservatively, multiplying the average weekly amount by 52, and then by 3. The number that stared back at me was sickening. My pen paused as I came to a larger, single transaction from 2 summers ago. A charge from an HVAC repair company for nearly $1,000. The memory flooded back with humiliating clarity. It was the height of a brutal August heat wave. Danny had called me, hysterical. "The AC is broken, Evelyn. It's over 90 degrees in the apartment. We can't breathe." I had imagined them sweltering, miserable. I'd felt a surge of maternal panic. I'd found a 24-hour repair service online and had paid for the emergency service with my own card, relieved when Donnie called back an hour later, cooing her thanks from her now chilled apartment. I had felt like a hero. Looking at it now, I saw the truth. I was not a hero, I was a mark. Two healthy, employed adults should have been able to handle their own air conditioning repair, but they knew they didn't have to. They had me. And then, I remembered the car. A cold dread, heavier and more sickening than anything before, settled in my stomach. Last year, they'd decided they needed a second car. Mark's old sedan was unreliable, and Danny needed something safe for her non-existent commute to a job she didn't have. They'd found a nearly new SUV, but there was a problem. Mark's credit, he'd explained sheepishly, wasn't great. The interest rate was astronomical, but if someone with good credit were to co-sign, just a formality, of course, they would make all the payments. "It's just to get the good rate, Mom," he'd promised. "You won't have to pay a thing." And I believed him. I went with him to the dealership, a sterile, soulless place smelling of plastic and desperation. I sat beside him as the finance manager slid the papers across the desk. I'd signed my name on the line, legally binding myself to their debt. I hadn't thought about it since. Now, the thought was a block of ice in my chest. If they defaulted on that loan, the bank wouldn't come after them. They would come after me. I didn't know the outstanding balance, but I wrote down the full initial value of the loan. It was a debt that hung over my head, a financial guillotine they had happily placed me under. The list grew. Gifts for birthdays and Christmases that were always far more extravagant than any I received in return. The cost of a surprise weekend trip to Chicago for their anniversary, a surprise they'd hinted at for weeks until I offered to pay for it. The vet bills for a dog they adopted on a whim and could not afford. The numbers piled up, one on top of the other, an ugly, sprawling testament to my own complicity. I put the pen down. I stared at the column of figures on the yellow legal pad. I added them all up, my finger tapping the keys on the calculator with a final, grim precision. The total came to more than $41,000. And that didn't even include the car. And that's when the tears came. They were not the hot, angry tears of betrayal. They were not the weak, self-pitying tears of a victim. They were tears of grief. A deep, wrenching sob tore through me, a sound of pure, undiluted mourning. I wasn't crying for the money. The money was just paper, just numbers. I was crying for the woman who had written those checks. I was grieving for the years I had lost, the years I had spent mistaking payment for love, transaction for connection. I wept for every time I had ignored the little red flags, for every condescending remark from Danny I had brushed aside, for every time Mark had been passive and silent when he should have defended me. I wept for the desperate, foolish hope that if I just gave enough, did enough, paid enough, I would earn my place in their lives. I saw, with agonizing clarity, that every dollar I had spent was not an act of love, but an act of fear, the fear of being alone, the fear of being irrelevant, the fear of losing my only son. The sobs racked my body until I was empty, until there were no tears left to cry. I sat there, slumped over the table, the tear-stained legal pad before me. The grief was a cleansing fire. It burned away the last vestiges of my self-deception. And in the ashes, what remained was not sorrow, it was clarity. The cold, hard number on the page was not a debt they owed me. It was a debt I had paid to learn the truth. I had paid $41,000 for this lesson. I had paid to understand that I was not a mother to them, but a resource to be exploited. I had paid to see that their affection was a commodity, given in exchange for financial support and withdrawn the moment the support was questioned. I sat up straight, my back aching. I wiped my wet cheeks with the back of my hand. I looked at the list one last time. It was no longer a record of my foolishness. It was my declaration of independence. It was the evidence. It was the reason. The debt was now officially accounted for. The books were closed, and a deep, quiet certainty settled over me. I knew, with absolute conviction, what I had to do next. Sleep had not been a refuge, it had been a forge. I had laid down in the dark, my body aching with the hollowed-out grief of my discovery, and had risen with the sun, not rested, but tempered. The woman who walked into the kitchen the next morning was not the same one who had wept over a yellow legal pad the day before. The grief had burned away, leaving behind a core of something hard and cool and unbreakable. The pad was still on the table, the column of numbers a silent, damning indictment. It was no longer a source of pain. It was a mission statement. I did not turn on my phone. The thought of the barrage of frantic, manipulative messages that awaited me held no power. They were the desperate pleas of ghosts, echoes from a life that was no longer mine. Instead, I made my coffee, the ritual familiar and grounding. I showered and dressed with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I bypassed the soft cardigans and comfortable slacks I usually wore and chose a pair of dark gray trousers, a crisp white blouse, and a structured navy blazer. It felt like armor. Looking in the mirror, I saw the face of a stranger. The lines of worry around my eyes seemed to have etched themselves into lines of resolve. The slight, perpetual stoop of a woman trying to make herself smaller was gone. I stood straight. My eyes were clear. I was Evelyn Brooks, and I was on my way to war. The drive to the bank was surreal. The familiar streets of Columbus passed by my car window, the same buildings, the same trees, but I saw them through a different lens. The world seemed sharper, more defined, now that the fog of their constant need had been lifted. Huntington Bank had been my bank for over 40 years. It was where Richard and I had opened our first joint account, where we'd secured the mortgage for this very house, where I had sat, numb with grief, closing his accounts after he passed. It had been a silent witness to the entire trajectory of my adult life. Today, it would be the place where I began a new one. I parked the car and walked toward the entrance, my sensible heels clicking with a firm, steady rhythm on the pavement. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stepped into the cool, quiet air of the lobby. The atmosphere was one of hushed reverence, like a library dedicated to the god of commerce. The faint scent of clean paper and polished marble filled the air. It was a world of rules, of balances, of consequences, a world entirely alien to the one Mark and Donnie had constructed for themselves. A young teller smiled at me. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I need to speak with the branch manager, please," I said, my voice steady. "Carl Benson." She directed me to a small waiting area, and a few moments later, Carl emerged from his office, a welcoming smile on his face. He was a man in his late 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a tie that was always perfectly knotted. He had handled my accounts for the last decade, and our interactions had always been pleasant, professional, and punctuated by small talk about the weather or the Ohio State Buckeyes. "Evelyn," he said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you. Come on in. Coffee?" "No, thank you, Carl," I said, taking a seat in the comfortable chair opposite his large, orderly desk. "I appreciate the offer, but this isn't a social visit." My tone, direct and devoid of its usual warmth, made him pause. He settled into his own chair, his smile fading into a look of professional concern. He folded his hands on his desk. "Of course, what can I do for you?" I took a breath. "I'm here to make some significant security changes to my accounts. All of them. I need a complete review of any and all automatic payments, recurring transfers, and third-party access." His eyebrows raised slightly, but his expression remained neutral. He was a good banker. He understood discretion. "All right," he said, turning to his computer and typing. "Let's pull up your profile." "We can certainly do that." He turned the monitor slightly toward me. My own name was at the top of the screen, followed by a list of account numbers, my checking, my savings, my retirement investment account. It was the architecture of my financial life. A life that, for 3 years, had been treated as a public utility by my son and his wife. "Let's start with scheduled transfers," he said, clicking a few keys. A list appeared. My heart gave a hard, painful lurch, but my face remained a mask of calm. There it was, in black and white. A recurring monthly payment, scheduled for the first of every month, to a landlord I'd never met. Another one, smaller, to Mark's account, labeled car note. A weekly Zelle payment, also to Mark, for expenses. "That one," I said, my voice a flat line as I pointed to the largest payment. "The rent. I want it cancelled. Effective immediately. And I want it blocked from ever being reinstated without my physical signature here, in this bank, with you." Carl's fingers flew across the keyboard. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was sure. He simply did as I asked. A small window popped up on his screen. "This will cancel all future payments," he confirmed. "Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. He clicked confirm. A small, satisfying green check mark appeared. The first chain was broken. "Next," I said, my voice gaining strength. "The car note." Click, click, confirm. Another chain fell away. "The weekly Zelle payment." Click, click, confirm. A third. "Now," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I need to know if any other individuals have online access or linked accounts to my checking or savings." Carl navigated to another screen. His brow furrowed for a moment. "Yes," he said slowly. "It looks like a debit card belonging to a Danielle Carter is linked as a payment source for several online utilities that are then billed back to your account. And she is authorized for online transfers." The memory of Donnie sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop, her voice a syrupy sweet melody of helpfulness, flashed through my mind. "Oh, Evelyn, this is so complicated. Let me just link my card to pay the bills, and you can just reimburse me from your account. It'll be so much easier for you to track." It had been a lie. All of it. A carefully constructed cage. "Revoke it," I said, the words like chips of ice. "Revoke all of it. I want her name, her accounts, her cards, everything scrubbed from any association with my money. I want a wall built between my finances and hers, and I want it to be 10 feet high and topped with barbed wire." For the first time, a flicker of something beyond professional concern crossed Carl's face. It was a deep, human empathy. He had seen this before. He knew what he was looking at, even without the details. He was looking at a woman reclaiming her life from a predator. "I understand completely," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll sever all links immediately. I would also recommend we change your online banking password, set up two-factor authentication, and put a verbal password on your account for any phone inquiries. Anyone calling would need to provide that specific word before we would even confirm you are a customer here." "Do it," I said. "All of it." As he worked, methodically and efficiently, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The concern in Carl Benson's eyes felt more genuine, more real, than any of the practiced affection I had received from my own family in years. He wasn't doing this because he loved me. He was doing this because it was his job to protect his clients' assets. It was a clean, clear, professional relationship, unburdened by the toxic, tangled mess of obligation and guilt. It was honest. When he was finished, he turned the screen back to me. It looked clean. Simple. Mine. "It's done, Evelyn," he said. "The accounts are secured. No one can access them online or by phone but you. No unauthorized payments will be going out." I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than they had when I walked in. I reached across the desk and shook his hand. "Thank you, Carl. You have no idea what this means to me." "I'm just doing my job," he said, but his eyes told me he understood. I walked out of the bank and back into the bright sunshine. The world felt different, lighter. I got into my car, but I didn't start the engine. I simply sat there, in the quiet of the parking lot. My purse was on the passenger seat, and inside it, my phone lay dormant and dark. I pulled it out, its smooth, black surface cool in my hand. For a moment, I was tempted to turn it on, to see the fallout, to witness the explosion I had just detonated. But I didn't. Instead, I pressed and held the power button until the option to power down appeared on the screen. I swiped my finger across it. The screen went black, the last link to their chaos, their demands, their endless, draining need, was severed. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The silence in the car was absolute, and for the first time since Richard died, I felt completely, utterly, and blessedly alone. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the clean, untainted air of my own life, and I breathed. The drive home was a revelation. With my phone dark and silent in my purse, the world outside my windshield seemed to have been rendered in high definition. The green of the late spring leaves was a deep, vibrant emerald, the sky a shade of blue so pure it ached. I felt as if I were emerging from a long, subterranean confinement into the light. For 3 years, every drive, every moment alone, had been tinged with a low-grade hum of anticipation. When would they call? What would they need next? Now, the only sound was the quiet thrum of the engine and the soft rush of air through the vents. The silence was not a void, it was a presence. It was the sound of my own life, waiting for me to reclaim it. On a whim, instead of going straight home, I pulled into the parking lot of the local library branch. The old brick building had been a sanctuary for me as a young girl and again as a young mother, a quiet harbor in a noisy world. I hadn't been inside in years. I had always been too busy, a phrase I now understood to be a euphemism for being too preoccupied with their manufactured crises. I walked through the doors, inhaling the beloved, timeless scent of old paper and bookbinding glue. I ran my fingers along the spines of novels, my touch tracing the titles of worlds I had yet to visit. I browsed the history section, picked up a travel guide for the coast of Maine, a place Richard and I had always talked about visiting. I sat in a comfortable, worn armchair by a large window and simply read, losing myself for an hour in someone else's story. It was a small, simple act of self-care, but it felt monumental. It was a declaration that my time, my thoughts, and my attention were once again my own. When I finally left, the sun was lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over my quiet neighborhood. A sense of profound, settled peace filled my chest. I had faced the beast, I had cut off its supply line, and I had survived. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it belonged to me. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the car, and took one last, deep breath of the peaceful air before getting out. The peace shattered the moment my key touched the lock. It didn't turn, the deadbolt wasn't engaged. A flicker of unease, cold and sharp, pierced my calm. I always locked the deadbolt. Always. I turned the knob, it was unlocked. My heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pushed the door open a few inches. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A man's cologne, sharp and unfamiliar, hung in the air, an invasive scent that did not belong in my home. The second thing was the mail. The small stack from my hall table was now on the floor, and one of the envelopes, a bank statement, was torn open. My blood ran cold. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, my purse clutched in my hand like a weapon. And then I saw them. They were in my living room. My living room. Mark, Danny, and a third man, a stranger in a tailored suit, who was perched on the edge of my favorite armchair as if he owned it. They weren't just standing there. They had invaded. My small file box, the one where I kept all my important papers, deeds, insurance policies, my will, was on the floor, its contents spilled out across my rug. Donnie was crouched down, her perfectly manicured fingers sifting through a stack of my medical records. Mark was standing by the fireplace, his face a mask of pale, anxious discomfort. They all looked up as I entered. For a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt, of being caught, in my son's eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a carefully constructed look of concern. Dani, however, didn't even bother to feign shame. She simply stood up, a file in her hand, her expression one of annoyed impatience, as if I were the one who had interrupted her. "Mom," Mark said, his voice strained. "Thank God. We were so worried." "Worried?" I repeated, my own voice low and dangerous, a sound I didn't recognize. "You were worried, so you broke into my house?" "The door was unlocked," Dani said dismissively, as if that were an invitation. "Your phone was off. We've been calling for hours. We had to make sure you weren't, on the floor or something." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it took my breath away. The man in the suit stood up, his movements smooth and practiced. He was tall, with silvering hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice a rich, condescending baritone. "My name is Arthur Davies. I'm the family attorney. Your son and his wife contacted me out of profound concern for your well-being." "My well-being," I said, my gaze sweeping over the violation of my personal papers strewn across the floor. "Is that what you call this, a wellness check?" "Mom, please," Mark interjected, taking a step toward me. "Just listen, we're here to help." "Help?" The word was a snarl. I took a step back, away from him, my hand coming up in a gesture to stop. "You are trespassing. You have rifled through my private documents. You have brought a stranger into my home without my permission. That is not help. That is a home invasion." Mr. Davies held up a placating hand, his smile unwavering. It was the smile of a man who was used to dealing with difficult, emotional women. "Evelyn, may I call you Evelyn? I understand this is upsetting. But your family has noticed some erratic behavior lately. Some troubling financial decisions. Turning off your phone, becoming unreachable. It's all part of a pattern that has them deeply concerned that you're becoming confused." Confused. The word hung in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart. It was the weapon they had chosen. I was not a woman who had been wronged, I was an old woman who had lost her mind. The clarity I felt was a sudden, blinding rage. They had not come to talk. They had come to conquer. "We're worried you're not capable of managing things on your own anymore, Mom," Mark mumbled, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just past my shoulder. He couldn't even look at me as he delivered the fatal blow. Mr. Davies took that as his cue. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers, thick and official-looking. He held it out to me. "This is a durable power of attorney, Evelyn," he explained, his voice oozing a repulsive, feigned gentleness. "It's a simple document. It would allow Mark and Dani to assist you with your finances, to pay your bills and manage your assets. It's a way for them to protect you from yourself. It would make everything so much simpler." "Oh. Simpler for who, exactly?" I asked, my voice like ice. "I didn't take the papers. It's just to make things easier, Evelyn." Dani chimed in, her voice dripping with the fake sweetness I now recognized as the sound of a predator closing in. "So we can handle all this stressful stuff for you. You shouldn't have to worry about it at your age." I looked at her, at the undisguised greed in her eyes. I looked at my son, his face a miserable portrait of weakness and complicity. And I looked at this stranger, this hired gun, who was here to legally erase me. They thought they had me cornered. The confused old woman, overwhelmed and alone. They expected tears. They expected capitulation. They had no idea who I was. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Davies's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Evelyn, I don't think you understand the alternative. If you're not willing to accept your family's help voluntarily, they may be forced to consider other legal avenues. For your own protection, of course. The state has mechanisms in place for situations like this. Guardianship proceedings can be unpleasant. There it was, the ultimate threat. Not just to take my money, but to take my life. My autonomy. My right to exist as a competent adult. They would have a court declare me mentally unfit, a ward of the state with them as my keepers. They would lock me away, literally or figuratively, and bleed my accounts dry at their leisure. Something inside me snapped. The rage became a white-hot, silent supernova. I felt my spine straighten, my shoulders go back. I was no longer a victim in my own home. I was its defender. I took a deliberate step forward, and all three of them flinched. My gaze locked onto the lawyer. "Mr. Davies," I said, and my voice was no longer quiet. It was clear, cold, and rang with an authority they had never heard before. "Your services are no longer required. You are trespassing on my property. I want you to gather your things and leave my house immediately." I then turned to Danny, who was staring at me, her mouth slightly agape. "And you. Put my papers back in their box and get out." Finally, I looked at my son, my only child. His face was ashen. "Mom, please," he began, his voice a weak whisper. "Do not call me Mom," I commanded, the words tearing out of me, sharp and final. "You lost that right when you stood by and let these people plot to strip me of my life. Get out of my house, Mark." They were frozen, stunned into silence by this new, formidable version of me. "Did you not hear me?" I said, my voice rising, imbued with all the fury and betrayal of the past week, the past 3 years. "I want you all out of my home. Now. If you are not off my property in 60 seconds, I will be calling the police." That broke the spell. A frantic energy filled the room. Mr. Davies, his professional composure shattered, hastily stuffed the power of attorney back into his briefcase. Donnie, her face a mask of pure, ugly rage, shoved my papers haphazardly back into the file box. Mark just stood there, paralyzed, until she hissed his name. They scrambled for the door, a disorderly retreat of thwarted thieves. I followed them, standing in the doorway as they hurried down my front walk. I did not say another word. I just watched them go, my presence a silent, immovable force. They piled into a car I didn't recognize, no doubt one Mr. Davies had driven, and sped away, the tires squealing in protest. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The heavy thud echoed in the sudden silence. I turned the lock. Then, I slid the deadbolt home. The solid, metallic clack was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I stood there for a long time, my back against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was quiet again, but the peace was gone. It had been violated, tainted by their presence, by their greed. This was no longer about a missed wedding or overdue rent. They had shown me their endgame. This was a fight not just for my money, but for my mind, for my freedom. And as the adrenaline began to subside, it was replaced by a single, chilling thought that settled in my soul. I was not finished. I had only just begun. The moment the car screeched away from the curb, the adrenaline that had held me upright threatened to give way, leaving me a trembling heap on the floor. My hand was white-knuckled on the newly bolted deadbolt. The scent of that lawyer's cologne, a cloying, predatory smell, still lingered in the air, a violation as tangible as the scattered papers on my living room floor. My home, my sanctuary for 40 years, felt contaminated. They had not just trespassed on my property, they had trespassed on my peace, on my very sense of self. But I did not collapse. The woman who had wept at the kitchen table was a ghost. In her place stood a soldier surveying a battlefield. The rage from moments before had cooled, hardening into a diamond-sharp clarity. They had fired the first shot in a war I did not ask for, but one I now intended to win. Their threat of guardianship, their casual, cruel use of the word confused, was not just an insult, it was a strategy. They had laid their cards on the table. They were coming for my mind, for my freedom. And I knew, with a certainty that vibrated in my bones, that I could not fight them alone. My first coherent thought was not of fear, but of action. I needed my own lawyer. Not a family attorney like the silver-haired vulture they had brought with them, but a shark. My shark. I did not turn on my cell phone. That was their territory, their line of attack. I walked into my study and sat at Richard's old desk, pulling out the heavy, alphabetized Rolodex he had so meticulously maintained. Under L for lawyer, there were several cards for the man who had handled our estate planning, a kind, gentle soul who was better suited for wills than for war. But behind his card was another, for a man Richard had once consulted on a business dispute. I remembered Richard's description: the kid's young, but he's a bulldog. Doesn't waste your time with pleasantries. The name on the card was Andrew Harris, attorney at law, bulldog. That's what I needed. My hand was perfectly steady as I dialed the number on my landline. A crisp, professional voice answered. I asked for Mr. Harris. When he came on the line, his voice was exactly as I'd imagined, direct, a little impatient, with no time for small talk. Andrew Harris. Mr. Harris, I said, my voice as level as his. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I am in need of immediate legal counsel regarding a case of potential elder financial abuse and a threatened guardianship action. Quote. There was a brief pause on the other end. The impatience in his voice was replaced by a focused attention. I have an opening at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Can you be here? I'll be there at 8:45, I said, and hung up. The next morning, I sat in his office, a neat, functional space that favored efficiency over opulence. Andrew Harris was indeed younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't ask about my day. He simply sat opposite me, a legal pad in front of him, and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." And so I did. I laid out the story, not as a wounded mother, but as a plaintiff stating her case. I spoke of the 3 years of financial support, the excluded wedding, the special guest's comment. I described the home invasion of the day before, the condescending lawyer, the pre-signed power of attorney they had pushed on me, and their final, chilling threat of guardianship. My voice did not shake. I did not cry. I presented the facts, the cold, hard timeline of my own exploitation. I slid the yellow legal pad, with its damning column of numbers, across his desk. He listened without interruption, his pen gliding across the page, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the list of figures I had calculated. He tapped the pen twice on the pad. Then he looked up, and his gaze was direct and clear. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, and the validation in his voice was the first real comfort I had felt in years. "Let's be perfectly clear about what this is. This is not a family misunderstanding. This is not a squabble over money. What you are describing is a classic, textbook case of elder financial abuse. What they attempted yesterday was a prelude to a fraudulent guardianship petition. Their goal is to have you declared incompetent so they can gain total control of your assets. They are not concerned. They are predatory." Hearing it named so plainly, so clinically, was like a bracing slap of cold water. It wasn't just my pain, it wasn't my overreaction, it was a crime. A recognized pattern of behavior with a name. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees weak. I was not confused, I was being attacked. "They are aggressive," Andrew continued, his voice all business. "Which means we have to be more aggressive. We need to build a fortress around you, legally and physically, and we need to do it immediately. Here is our action plan." He leaned forward, and the energy in the room shifted. It was the energy of a battle being planned. "First, today, you are going to a locksmith. You will have every exterior lock on your house changed. The garage, the front door, the back door. Everything. They have had a key. That privilege is revoked." I nodded, the practicality of the step a solid anchor. Second, you are going to buy and install video doorbell cameras. One for the front, one for the back. From this moment on, every interaction they attempt at your home will be recorded. If they show up, you do not open the door. You speak to them through the camera, stating clearly that they are not welcome on your property. Then you save the recording. My fortress would have eyes. I nodded again. Third, that new bank account you mentioned wanting to open? You're not just opening a new account at Huntington. You are going to a completely different bank where they have never seen your face. You will open a new checking and savings, and over the next week, we will facilitate the transfer of all your liquid assets. Your current bank is compromised ground. A financial firewall. Complete and total. Fourth, and this is the most important, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. We are going to completely overhaul your estate plan. New will. New beneficiaries. We will legally and systematically write them out of your life and your legacy. Their expectation of an inheritance is the fuel for this fire. We are going to take it away. The finality of it was breathtaking. It was the ultimate statement, the last word I would have. It was not about revenge, it was about truth. They had treated me as if I were already dead, a vault of money waiting to be inherited. I would simply make the legal arrangements reflect the reality they had created. I'll do it, I said, my voice firm. All of it. Good, he said, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. They have underestimated you, Mrs. Brooks. That is our greatest advantage. Go. I left his office feeling not just empowered, but reborn. The world was no longer a place of threat, but a place of possibility. I drove directly to Home Depot, the cavernous store, a cathedral of self-reliance. I walked the aisles, the smell of sawdust and metal filling my lungs. I found the section for locks and security. The weight of the new deadbolt sets in my shopping cart was real, solid, reassuring. I was not buying hardware, I was buying my sovereignty. From there, I called a 24-hour locksmith, who met me at my house within the hour. The sound of him drilling out the old locks was the sound of my past being excised. The final, satisfying click of the new key turning in the new deadbolt was the sound of my future beginning. While he worked, I installed the Ring cameras myself, the simple, step-by-step instructions a calming balm. My fortress was secure, but I knew this wasn't just about physical and legal defenses. It was also about reclaiming the woman they had tried to erase. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made an appointment at Cindy's salon, the little beauty parlor downtown I used to frequent before I got too busy. Cindy, a woman with a cloud of pink hair and a heart of gold, clucked her tongue when she saw me. Evelyn Brooks, I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Sit. What are we doing today? I want it all cut, I said, looking at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was long, straggly, the color faded. It was the hair of a woman who had given up. I want something sharp. And I want the gray gone. For the next 2 hours, I let her work her magic. The snipping of her scissors felt like the cutting of old tangled ties. The warmth of the hair dye on my scalp felt like a comforting balm. When she finally spun me around to face the mirror, I gasped. The woman looking back at me was me. But a version I hadn't seen in a decade. My hair was a chic, sharp bob, colored a rich, warm brown that made my eyes sparkle. I looked strong. I looked confident. I looked like I was in charge. I walked out of that salon feeling taller. As I pulled into my driveway, my next-door neighbor, Margaret Reynolds, was out tending her roses. She was a kind, no-nonsense widow about my age, and we'd always had a friendly, if distant, relationship. She looked up as I got out of the car, and her eyes widened. "Well, look at you, Evelyn," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "You look like $1,000,000. New haircut for a new season?" The old me would have deflected, mumbled something about just needing a change. The new me told a piece of the truth. "Something like that," I said, a small, real smile touching my own lips. Just decided it was time to upgrade my security. New locks, new hair, new outlook. I gestured to the new, gleaming doorbell camera. Margaret's smile softened into a look of quiet understanding. She was a shrewd woman. "Good for you," she said, her voice dropping a little. "Sometimes you have to bolt the doors to keep the trouble out, even when the trouble has a key. My door's always open if you ever need a cup of sugar, or an ear." It wasn't an interrogation. It was an offer. A simple, solid gesture of solidarity from another woman who understood that the world wasn't always a kind place. She was the first brick in the new wall I was building around myself, not a wall to keep the world out, but a support wall, built of sane, supportive adults. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, and I meant it. "I appreciate that more than you know." That night, for the first time, I felt truly safe in my own home. The new locks were bolted. The cameras were on. My fortress was complete. And I was no longer a confused old woman waiting for the next attack. I was Evelyn Brooks, 70 years old, the commander of my own life. And I was ready. The fortress I was building wasn't just made of new locks and legal documents. I understood, with the instinct of a woman who had just survived a siege, that the most critical fortifications were human. For years, my world had shrunk, contracting to a tight, suffocating circle of two, Mark and Donnie. I had let my other relationships wither, telling myself I was too busy, too tired, or that they simply wouldn't understand the delicate, complex dance of my obligations. I saw now that this isolation had been a key part of their strategy. A solitary, unsupported target is an easy one. My quiet withdrawal hadn't been a symptom of aging. It had been a symptom of being controlled. It was time to rebuild my alliances. There was one person in particular whose absence in my life felt like a self-inflicted wound, my younger sister, Denise. We had always been close, two sides of the same coin. I was the quiet, steady one, she was the fiery, outspoken one. But in the last few years, our calls had grown infrequent, our conversations strained. I would talk vaguely about how busy Mark and Donnie were, and I could feel her disapproval radiating through the phone line, a silent judgment I didn't want to hear. So, I stopped calling as often. It was easier to retreat into my bubble of denial than to face the hard truths I knew she would offer. Now, I needed that truth. I needed her fire. I sat at my kitchen table, the new confidence from my haircut and the secured house a tangible presence around me. I dialed her number in Cincinnati, my heart thumping a little, not with fear, but with a pang of regret for the time I had wasted. She answered on the second ring. "Evelyn, is that you?" Her voice was a mixture of surprise and genuine warmth. "It's me, Denise," I said, and to my own surprise, my voice cracked a little with emotion. I'm sorry it's been so long." "Better late than never," she said, her tone softening immediately. She had always been able to read me, even over the phone. "What's wrong, Ev? I can hear it in your voice. Is it Mark?" The dam broke. The carefully constructed, factual narrative I had given to my lawyer dissolved, and I told my sister everything, this time with all the messy, painful emotion I had suppressed. I told her about the wedding, the years of paying bills, the humiliation, the home invasion, and the threat of guardianship. I didn't just state the facts. I shared the shame, the foolishness, the soul deep hurt of it all. I wasn't a plaintiff stating a case. I was a big sister talking to her little sister, my voice thick with unshed tears. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, the silence on her end of the line a heavy, supportive presence. When I finally finished, my voice a hoarse whisper, she was quiet for a moment. I could practically hear her simmering. "That little," she started, then cut herself off, her voice tight with a fury that was entirely on my behalf. "Eve, I've been biting my tongue for 3 years. 3 years. The last time you all came down for Thanksgiving, all they did was talk about you." "Talk about me?" I asked, a fresh wave of hurt washing over me. "Not in a good way," she said, her voice grim. It was all about when we inherit the house. Donnie was talking about the renovations she was planning, how she was going to knock out the wall between the kitchen and your study. Mark just sat there and nodded along. It made my skin crawl. It was like they were picking over your bones before you were even gone. Her words were brutal. A gut punch. To hear it confirmed, that their greedy, ghoulish planning had been so brazen, so open, sent a chill through me. But strangely, the pain was secondary to a feeling of profound, validating relief. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. Denise had seen it too. She had seen the avarice behind their smiles, the calculation in their eyes. I wanted to say something, Denise continued, her voice filled with regret. I wanted to shake you and tell you to open your eyes. But you had this wall up, Ev. Every time I'd even hint that maybe you were doing too much, you'd get so defensive. I didn't know how to reach you. I'm sorry, Denise, I whispered, tears finally tracing a path down my cheeks. You were right, I didn't want to see it. Don't you dare apologize, she said fiercely. You loved your son. You did what you thought a mother was supposed to do. They are the ones who twisted it, who weaponized your love against you. This is not your fault, this is their crime. We talked for another hour. She told me I was a warrior. She told me she was proud of me. She made me promise to call her every single day with an update. By the time we hung up, I felt 10 pounds lighter. The burden of my secret, the shame of my own perceived foolishness, had been shared, and in sharing it, its power over me was diminished. Denise's righteous anger was a shield, her unwavering belief in me a sword. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had my sister back. The next day, emboldened by my conversation with Denise, I acted on Margaret's offer. I baked a lemon poppy seed loaf, another simple pleasure I hadn't indulged in for ages, and carried it next door, the plate still warm in my hands. Margaret opened the door, wiping her hands on an apron. Her face lit up when she saw me. Evelyn, what's this? Just a thank you, I said. For your offer yesterday. It meant a lot. She ushered me into her cozy, sun-filled kitchen, a space that felt like a warm hug. It was the complete opposite of my own home's recent sterile tension. As she made us tea, I found myself telling her the broad strokes of my situation. I didn't go into the gut-wrenching detail I had with Denise, but I told her about the boundaries I was now being forced to draw with my family. She listened, nodding slowly, her expression one of deep, knowing empathy. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't surprised. Boundaries, she said, setting a steaming mug in front of me. They're invisible fences, aren't they? People don't know they're there until they run right into them. And Lord, do they get angry when they get zapped. She then told me her own story. After her husband passed, her eldest daughter, who lived out of state, had begun to treat her like an aging, incompetent child. She'd call at all hours, demanding to know if Margaret had taken her pills, grilling her about her finances, insisting she sell her house and move into a sensible retirement community near her. For a year, I let her run me ragged, Margaret said, her gaze distant for a moment. I felt guilty. I felt like I owed her my compliance, that it was a daughter's right to worry. But it wasn't worry, Evelyn. It was control. She wanted my life to be convenient for her. One day, she called and started in on me about how I'd arranged the furniture in my own living room, and I just snapped. I told her, Linda, this is my house, my furniture, and my life. I am a grown woman. You will speak to me with respect, or you will not speak to me at all. And then I hung up. What happened? I asked, leaning forward, completely captivated. She didn't call for a month, Margaret said with a wry smile. I think she expected me to fall apart, to come crawling back, but I didn't. I went on living my life, and you know what? It was the most peaceful month I'd had in a year. When she finally did call back, she was different. More respectful. Cautious. She'd run into the fence, and she'd learned her lesson. We have a good relationship now, but it's a relationship of equals. not a warden and her charge. Her story was a gift. It was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation that I was on the right path. My situation was more extreme, laced with financial predation, but the dynamic was the same. The insidious creep of control disguised as concern. The slow erosion of self that happens when you constantly put someone else's perceived needs ahead of your own right to live. Margaret and I sat and talked for the rest of the afternoon. We talked about gardening, about our late husbands, about the changing neighborhood. We talked about the simple, profound joy of a quiet house and a life lived on one's own terms. When I finally walked back to my own home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. I felt a fundamental shift within me. In the space of just a few days, I had gone from a terrified, isolated victim to a woman surrounded by a bulwark of support. I had my bulldog lawyer, Andrew, for the legal battle. I had my fiery sister, Denise, for the emotional war. And now I had my neighbor, Margaret, a calm, wise ally right next door. My circle was no longer the suffocating knot of two, but a growing, expanding ring of sane, strong, supportive adults. They had tried to isolate me, to convince me that I was confused and alone. But they had failed. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my generosity for foolishness. And they had no idea that while they were regrouping, plotting their next move, I was busy assembling an army. The weeks that followed were a strange paradox. On the one hand, my life had become a meticulously organized campaign, a series of strategic moves executed with the precision of a general. I met with Andrew Harris twice a week, methodically working through the overhaul of my estate. The process of dismantling the future they had taken for granted was empowering. With each document I signed the new will, naming Denise as my executor and primary beneficiary, the updated healthcare directive, the carefully worded trust that would protect my assets. I felt another chain fall away. I opened my new bank account at a small, local credit union where no one knew my name, and the act of transferring the bulk of my life's savings felt like moving my resources to a secure, fortified bunker. The numbers, once a source of shame, were now a source of strength. They were my ammunition. On the other hand, outside of the legal war room, my personal life began to blossom in ways I hadn't thought possible. My daily calls with Denise became the bedrock of my emotional resilience. We didn't always talk about the situation. We talked about our childhoods, we gossiped about cousins, we shared recipes. We were rebuilding the sisterhood I had allowed to languish, and it was a balm to my soul. My friendship with Margaret deepened, moving from neighborly chats over the fence to shared cups of tea in the afternoon and, eventually, a weekly Scrabble game that became a fierce but friendly rivalry. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who asked for nothing but my company, who saw me not as a resource, but as a person. The silence in my house was no longer the oppressive quiet of loneliness, it was the peaceful, chosen quiet of a woman content in her own skin, in her own home. But I was not naive. I knew this peace was the calm before the storm. Mark and Danny had been silent since the day I threw them out, but it was not the silence of retreat. It was the silence of a predator regrouping, planning a new angle of attack. Their frontal assault had failed. I had repelled their attempt to seize control through intimidation. Andrew had warned me what would likely come next. "They won't give up," he'd said, his voice grim. "The stakes are too high for them. They'll escalate. They'll try to use institutions against you, to make their concern look official." I didn't have to wait long. The knock on my door came on a sunny Thursday morning. It was not the tentative rap of a neighbor or the brisk tap of a delivery person. It was a loud, firm, official-sounding knock that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I walked to the door, my heart a steady, heavy drumbeat. I did not open it. I pressed the button on my phone to activate the video doorbell's intercom. On my screen, a man and a woman stood on my porch. They were dressed in unremarkable business casual attire, but they carried themselves with an air of bureaucratic authority. They both held out ID badges toward the camera. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks? The woman asked, her voice polite but firm. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and this is my colleague, Tom Riley. We're with Franklin County Adult Protective Services. We're here to conduct a wellness check. Adult Protective Services. The name itself was a weapon, designed to intimidate, to imply frailty and incompetence. This was it. The institutional escalation. My mouth went dry, but my voice, when I spoke into the phone, was calm and clear. Years of watching courtroom dramas had, it seemed, prepared me for this moment. Good morning, I said, my voice projecting evenly through the small speaker. I can see your identification. May I ask the purpose of this wellness check? Has a report been filed? The woman, Miss Jenkins, seemed slightly taken aback by my composure. She had likely expected a flustered, confused old woman, perhaps one who would fling the door open in a panic. Yes, ma'am, she said, recovering quickly. We received a report from a concerned family member. The report alleges potential self-neglect and possible cognitive decline. We're obligated to investigate. Concerned family member. The phrase was so obscenely dishonest it was almost laughable. The sheer, breathtaking gall of them, to attempt a hostile takeover of my life, and when that failed, to run crying to the government, painting themselves as worried children and me as a helpless, senile old woman. The rage that flashed through me was cold and sharp, but I did not let it show. I had a plan for this. Andrew and I had rehearsed it. I see, I said, my tone remaining level. While I can assure you I am perfectly well, I understand you have a job to do. However, my attorney has advised me not to engage in any official inquiries without him being present. I am calling him now. Please feel free to wait on the porch. I'll be with you shortly. I did not wait for their response. I cut the connection, leaving them standing in the bright morning sun. My hands were shaking now, a fine tremor of adrenaline and anger. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked to my landline, dialing Andrew's direct number. He answered immediately. They're there? He asked. No preamble necessary. APS, I confirmed. A Miss Jenkins and a Mr. Riley. They're on the porch. Excellent, he said, and the satisfaction in his voice was a potent antidote to my fear. Do not let them in, do not say another word to them. Tell them through the intercom that your attorney is en route and will be there in 15 minutes. I'm leaving now. Go ding. I did as he instructed, my voice once again a mask of calm composure as I relayed the message through the doorbell. Then, I waited. I watched them on the camera feed. They exchanged a few words, looking slightly frustrated, their well-oiled bureaucratic machine having hit an unexpected bump in the road. They had come expecting to find a vulnerable senior citizen. They had found a locked door and a lawyer on the way. 15 minutes later, Andrew's car pulled into the driveway. He strode up the walk, his briefcase in hand, a man radiating an aura of crisp, no-nonsense competence. I watched on the camera as he introduced himself. After a brief, professional exchange, he called me on my cell. Evelyn, you can open the door now. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, stepping back to allow the three of them into my entryway. I was no longer a lone woman facing down government agents. I was a client, flanked by her legal counsel. The power dynamic had been completely re-established. We sat in the living room, the same room where the invasion had taken place weeks before. But now, it was my turf, and I was in command. I had made a point to tidy up that morning, as I always did. The room was clean, the mail was sorted neatly on the desk, and a vase of fresh-cut roses from Margaret's garden sat on the coffee table. There was no sign of neglect here. Miss Jenkins began, her tone a careful blend of professional empathy and probing inquiry. Mrs. Brooks, our goal here is just to ensure you're safe and that your needs are being met. The report mentioned you've recently made some abrupt changes, isolating yourself, cutting off family. Before I could answer, Andrew held up a hand. My client will answer your questions, he said smoothly. But let's be clear about the context. The family in question recently attempted to coerce Mrs. Brooks into signing a durable power of attorney under duress, after letting themselves into her home without permission. When she refused, they threatened her with a guardianship filing. Their concern only manifested after Mrs. Brooks secured her financial accounts from their continued, unauthorized access. This is not a wellness check, Miss Jenkins. It is a retaliatory action, and a transparent one at that. The two caseworkers exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. This was not the simple, open and shut case of a confused senior they had been led to expect. "We still have to follow our procedure, counselor," Mr. Riley said, his voice a low grumble. He turned to me. "Mrs. Brooks, can you tell us who handles your finances? Do you pay your own bills?" "I handle my own finances," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I have done so my entire adult life. I pay my bills online, on time, from a new account I recently opened to protect my assets. Here are my most recent statements." I gestured to a neat file folder I had prepared on Andrew's advice. It contained my bank statements, showing a healthy balance and no overdue notices, and copies of my paid utility bills. The report also mentioned concerns about your home's upkeep, Miss Jenkins pressed on. "As you can see," I said, gesturing around the immaculate room, "my home is well maintained. The lawn was mowed 2 days ago, and I have a cleaning service that comes every other Friday. I would be happy to give you a tour." "And your social connections?" she asked. "The report alleges you've been isolating yourself." "Quite the contrary," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips. "I've been reconnecting with my life. I speak with my sister in Cincinnati every day. My neighbor and I have a standing Scrabble game on Tuesdays. I was at the library just last week. My social life is, frankly, more active now than it has been in years." Andrew stepped in again. "Furthermore," he said, opening his briefcase, "Mrs. Brooks has already taken proactive steps to secure her future. Here is a copy of her recently updated will and her new, comprehensive healthcare directive. These are the actions of a competent, forward-thinking individual, not someone in a state of cognitive decline." He slid the documents across the coffee table. The caseworkers were silent. They looked at the pristine house. They looked at the organized financial records. They looked at the legal documents. They looked at me, a well-dressed, well-spoken, and clearly well-defended woman. The narrative that Mark and Danny had spun for them, the story of a confused, neglected old mother, was unraveling before their very eyes. They had come here to investigate a victim. They had found a fortress. After a few more perfunctory questions, it was clear the interview was over. Miss Jenkins and Mr. Riley stood up, their professional masks firmly back in place. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Brooks." "Mr. Harris," Miss Jenkins said, her voice betraying a hint of weary resignation. "We have everything we need. We'll be filing our report." Andrew walked them to the door. I stood in the living room, my heart beating steadily. I had not been defensive. I had not been emotional. I had been prepared. I had met their institutional attack with institutional-grade evidence. Andrew closed the door behind them and turned to me, a rare, wide grin on his face. "That," he said, "is what you call shutting it down. They have no case, Evelyn. Their report will say unsubstantiated. You were brilliant." A wave of profound, triumphant relief washed through me. "They'll try something else, won't they?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Oh, absolutely," he said, his smile fading back into a look of grim determination. "They've just lost control of the official narrative. They're not going to like that. But now they know, we're ready for them." And I was. They had tried to use the system to label me. Instead, the system had just validated me. Their weapon had backfired. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that their next move would be even more desperate, and even more dangerous. But I was no longer afraid, I was fortified. The official letter from Adult Protective Services arrived a week later. The envelope was plain, bureaucratic, but my hands were steady as I opened it. Andrew had already called to give me the news, but seeing it in print was a different kind of victory. The words were a shield. Following a thorough investigation into the report filed on your behalf, we have found the allegations of self-neglect and cognitive decline to be unsubstantiated. This case is now officially closed. Unsubstantiated. A beautiful, sterile, bureaucratic word that translated to a single, powerful truth. I had won. I placed the letter on my desk, a trophy from a battle I hadn't started but had decisively finished. A quiet, profound sense of security settled over me. The system they had tried to weaponize against me had, in the end, become part of my defense. My fortress had been tested, and it had held. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the worst might actually be over. Perhaps, having been so thoroughly and officially rebuffed, they would finally retreat. Perhaps the silence that followed would be one of final, grudging defeat. It was a foolish hope. I had underestimated the depths of their entitlement, the sheer, ferocious tenacity of their greed. They had not been chastened by their failure with APS, they had merely been forced to change tactics. Having failed to portray me as a victim of neglect, they would now pivot to proving I was a victim of my own mind, and they would do it by bypassing the public system and hiring their own private executioners. The doorbell rang 2 weeks to the day after the APS letter arrived. It was another Thursday morning. I had just come in from my garden, my hands smelling of soil and tomato leaves, a small basket of cherry tomatoes on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the video feed on my phone, expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps Margaret coming over for an early cup of tea. Instead, my blood ran cold. Standing on my porch was a woman I had never seen before. She was in her 50s, with an expensive-looking haircut and a severe, unsmiling expression. She wore a dark pantsuit and carried a leather portfolio. Beside her stood a younger man, dressed in scrubs, holding a metal clipboard. He had the bland, impassive look of a medical assistant. They did not look like friends or neighbors. They looked like an invading army in miniature. I took a deep, steadying breath, my brief sense of peace evaporating like morning mist. The war was not over. A new front had just been opened on my doorstep. I activated the intercom, my voice a flat, neutral tone. "Can I help you?" The woman in the pantsuit stepped closer to the camera, her expression one of utter confidence. She held up no identification. She offered no pleasantries. "Evelyn Brooks," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative, as if she were addressing a subordinate. "My name is Dr. Alana Finch. This is my assistant, Daniel. We are here to conduct a private wellness evaluation." Wellness evaluation. The phrase was so bland, so deceptively benign, but I heard the threat coiled within it like a snake. This was not a doctor. This was a hired gun, a psychiatrist, no doubt, brought in to create the evidence that APS had failed to find. They were no longer alleging incompetence. They were here to manufacture it. My mind raced, but my voice remained calm. Andrew's words echoed in my head. "Do not open the door. Document everything. State your position clearly." "I'm sorry," I said, my tone polite but unyielding. "There must be some mistake. I have not scheduled any such evaluation." "Who sent you?" "Doctor." Finch's thin lips tightened in annoyance. She was clearly not accustomed to being questioned. "Your son, Mark Gardner, and his wife retained my services. They are deeply concerned about your recent behavior and have requested a professional assessment of your cognitive capacity. It is in your best interest to cooperate, Mrs. Brooks. This can be done simply and discreetly here, or it can become a more public matter." The threat was unmistakable. Cooperate with their private inquisition, or they would use my refusal as evidence of my paranoia and instability in a public court filing. It was a brilliant, vicious, and utterly terrifying strategy. The old me would have crumpled. The old me would have been flustered, intimidated, worried about what the neighbors would think, and would have likely opened the door just to make the confrontation go away. But the old me was gone. "Dr. Finch," I said, my voice as cold and hard as polished steel. "Let me be perfectly clear. You are on my property without invitation. You were retained by individuals who have a clear and documented financial motive to have me declared incompetent. You are not a physician here to help, you are an agent hired to harass me. You are not welcome here." The doctor's composure finally cracked. A flush of angry color rose on her neck. "Mrs. Brooks, your refusal to participate in a standard evaluation will be noted in my report. It strongly suggests you have something to hide and is indicative of paranoia and an unwillingness to accept care. I would advise you to reconsider." "The only thing I am reconsidering is how quickly I should call the police," I retorted. "But first, I am calling my attorney. Please remove yourselves from my porch." I cut the connection. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was with pure, unadulterated rage. The audacity of it. To send a hired psychiatrist to my home as if they were ordering a pizza, expecting me to submit to an examination designed to strip me of my rights. I immediately dialed Andrew. I explained the situation, my words clipped and precise. His response was a low, furious hiss. "I was afraid of this. This is harassment by proxy, Evelyn. It's a classic, bottom-feeder tactic. Stay calm. You are doing everything right. Have you told them to leave?" "I have," I said. "And they're still there?" he asked. I glanced at the video feed. They hadn't moved. They were standing there, conferring in low tones, a stubborn, menacing presence on my doorstep. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, his voice grim. "Then we're going to the next step. I'm on my way, but it will take me a little longer this time. I want you to call the non-emergency police line. Tell them there are 2 individuals on your property who are refusing to leave and that you have a restraining order in process against the parties who sent them. Tell them you feel harassed and unsafe." Use those exact words, harassed and unsafe. The thought of calling the police, of turning my private war into a public spectacle, made my stomach clench. But Andrew was right, they had brought the battle to my doorstep. I had to use every weapon at my disposal to defend it. I made the call. The dispatcher was calm and professional. I explained the situation as Andrew had instructed, my voice clear and steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. She assured me a patrol car would be dispatched. The wait was agonizing. I watched the 2 of them on my porch through the camera feed, my silent sentinels. They were growing more impatient, Dr. Finch checking her watch, the assistant shifting his weight from foot to foot. They were predators who had expected a quick and easy kill, and the resistance was clearly frustrating them. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. A uniformed officer, a woman with a calm, authoritative demeanor, got out and walked up my driveway. I watched on the screen as she approached Dr. Finch and the assistant. "Good morning," the officer said, her voice clearly audible through the doorbell's microphone. "I'm Officer Miller. I received a call about 2 individuals refusing to leave this property." Dr. Finch immediately launched into her well-rehearsed speech. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. I am Dr. Alana Finch, a licensed psychiatrist. We are here at the request of the family to conduct a wellness check on an elderly patient, Mrs. Brooks. She is exhibiting paranoid behavior and is refusing care. She was trying to frame me as the problem, the hysterical old woman inside the house. But Officer Miller was not swayed. She turned her gaze to my front door, to the gleaming metal of the video camera. "Ma'am," she said, speaking directly to me through the intercom. "This is Officer Miller. The individuals here claim you are in need of assistance. Are you in distress? Do you require medical attention?" This was my moment. This was the official record. I took a deep breath. "Officer Miller, thank you for coming," I said, my voice projecting with clarity and strength. "I am Evelyn Brooks. I am not in any distress, and I do not require any medical attention. These two individuals were hired by my son and daughter-in-law, against whom my attorney is currently filing a protection order for financial abuse and harassment. These people are strangers to me. I have asked them to leave my property, and they have refused. I feel harassed and unsafe." The officer's expression hardened. She turned back to Dr. Finch, her professional demeanor now decidedly chilly. "Dr. Finch, you are on private property. The resident has made it clear she does not want you here and that she feels harassed by your presence. I am now instructing you to leave the premises immediately." The doctor's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. Her professional authority had been completely undermined. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "I have a duty. Your duty does not include trespassing." Officer Miller cut her off, her voice sharp. "Leave now, or I will be forced to issue a citation. And I can assure you, a trespassing charge will not look good on your medical license." That was the final blow. Defeated, Dr. Finch shot one last, venomous look at my front door, then turned on her heel and stalked back toward the street, her assistant trailing meekly behind her. I watched until their car pulled away and disappeared around the corner. Officer Miller remained for a moment. "Ma'am," she said into the intercom. "They're gone. Are you all right?" "I am now," I said, the relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. "Thank you, officer. Thank you so much. You did the right thing by not opening the door and calling us," she said. "We'll file a report of the incident. You have a good day now." I watched her walk back to her cruiser and drive away. The street was quiet again. The siege was over. When Andrew arrived a few minutes later, I opened the door to him, my hands still trembling slightly. He took one look at my face and put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Evelyn," he said, his voice filled with a fierce pride. "You held the line. What now, Andrew?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What else can they possibly do?" He looked at me, his expression grim. This was their last attempt at a preemptive strike, at creating evidence outside the system. It failed. They have only one move left now. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They're going to take us to court." Andrew's prediction was not a guess, it was a certainty. The failure of their private ambush on my doorstep had stripped away their last shred of plausible deniability. Their pretense of concern was now a transparently flimsy cover for their naked aggression. They had been blocked, officially and publicly, at every turn. They had tried intimidation, failed. They had tried leveraging a state agency, failed. They had tried harassment by a private proxy, and had been summarily dismissed by the police. Like cornered, desperate animals, they now had only one path left, a full frontal legal assault. The official notification arrived by certified mail 10 days later. The thick envelope from the Franklin County Probate Court felt like a block of ice in my hands. Even though I was expecting it, the reality of the document was a physical blow. It was a petition for adult guardianship and conservatorship, filed on behalf of the petitioners, Mark Gardner and Danielle Carter, for the protection of the respondent, Evelyn Brooks. I was the respondent. A legal term for a target. I didn't read the details. Not at first. I simply held the papers, the formal, black and white text, a declaration of war from my only child. They were formally, legally, attempting to have me declared an incompetent, a child in the eyes of the law, a person whose life and assets required their benevolent, protective control. I carried the envelope to the phone and called Andrew. "It's here," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. It was the calm of a soldier who has just heard the first artillery shell scream overhead. "Bring it in," he said. "Don't read it alone. We'll go through it together." Gut. An hour later, I was sitting in his office, the petition spread out on the polished surface of his conference table. Andrew read through it with a lawyer's dispassionate focus, his pen making small, sharp notes in the margins. I, on the other hand, felt every word like a paper cut to the soul. The petition was a masterpiece of fiction, a carefully curated narrative of my supposed decline. It was filled with half-truths, twisted facts, and outright lies, all designed to paint a picture of a paranoid, confused, and dangerously isolated old woman. They cited my decision to change the locks and install cameras not as a prudent security measure, but as a sign of debilitating paranoia. My refusal to speak with them was not a boundary, it was unhealthy isolation. My wise decision to secure my finances was twisted into erratic and impulsive financial behavior. Go. But the most venomous parts were the attached statements, the evidence from their supposed witnesses. They had found their proxies. The first was a signed affidavit from a neighbor a few houses down, a cranky, cantankerous man named Mr. Henderson whom I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 20 years. He was a notorious curmudgeon who complained about everyone. In his statement, he claimed to have observed me, talking to myself in my garden, a complete fabrication of my habit of humming as I worked, and that I often seemed agitated and lost. It was a character assassination by a man who didn't even know my favorite color. I could almost hear Donnie's sweet, manipulative voice as she'd coached him, playing on his innate suspicion of the world. The second statement was even more insidious. It was from the pharmacist at the large chain drugstore I had stopped using a few months ago. It stated that on several occasions, I had seemed confused about my prescriptions. The truth was that I had questioned the pharmacist about a change in the color of a generic pill, a perfectly reasonable inquiry for any patient. But in their narrative, my due diligence was reframed as senility. They had found two people on the periphery of my life and had successfully duped them, turning them into unwitting soldiers in their army. When Andrew finished reading, he leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. "This is garbage," he said, the words a low growl. "It's a smear campaign, Evelyn. They're throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks." A cranky neighbor and a pharmacist who misinterpreted a valid question. This is the best they could come up with. "It feels so ugly," I whispered, the vile, twisted version of myself they had created on the page making me feel physically ill. "That's the point," Andrew said, his gaze hardening. "They want you to feel that way. They want to overwhelm you, to make you feel helpless, to make you doubt yourself. Their entire case is built on perception, not on fact. And that is exactly how we are going to dismantle it. We are not going to fight their fiction with opinions. We are going to obliterate it with a mountain of irrefutable, expert evidence." Thus began the next phase of our campaign, the counter-offensive. While they had been out collecting gossip and twisting benign interactions, we had been building a case based on solid, unimpeachable truth. Andrew's action plan was swift and comprehensive. Our first and most critical move was to secure our own expert witness. "They have their hired gun in Dr. Finch, who will testify that your refusal to be evaluated is a sign of your illness," Andrew explained. "We need our own evaluation, but from a respected, top-tier, forensic neuropsychologist, someone whose credentials and reputation are beyond reproach." He made a call, and 2 days later, I was in the quiet, calm office of Dr. Elena Morales. She was a woman in her 60s with a warm, intelligent face and a manner that was both deeply empathetic and rigorously professional. The evaluation was not a simple conversation. It was a comprehensive, hours-long series of tests. She assessed my memory, my reasoning skills, my financial literacy, my executive function. She asked me about my life, my routines, my relationships. I did not feel like a patient being diagnosed, I felt like a person being seen. I told her everything, without shame or reservation. I showed her the legal pad with the numbers. I told her about my sister, about Margaret. I told her about the fear, and about the strength I had found in its wake. A week later, Dr. Morales' report was on Andrew's desk. It was a thick, detailed, 20-page document. Andrew read the summary aloud to me. Conclusion: Mrs. Evelyn Brooks is a highly intelligent and articulate individual who is functioning in the superior range of cognitive ability for her age group. She exhibits no signs of cognitive decline or impairment. Her recent actions to secure her finances and personal safety are not indicative of paranoia, but are, in fact, a logical and rational response to a clear pattern of financial exploitation and psychological pressure from her son and daughter-in-law. She is fully competent to manage her own affairs. I started to cry. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, profound relief. It was a complete and total vindication from a respected expert in the field. It was the truth, certified and signed. This report was not just a piece of evidence, it was my shield. But we didn't stop there. Andrew deposed Carl Benson, the manager at my old bank. Under oath, Carl testified that I had always been a sharp, engaged, and fully competent client. He described the day I came in to lock down my accounts, not as a woman who was confused, but as a woman who was decisive and clear in her instructions. His testimony painted a picture of a client taking rational, protective measures. Next, Andrew took sworn statements from my real support network. A lengthy, heartfelt affidavit from my sister, Denise, which not only confirmed my lucidity but also provided first-hand testimony of Mark and Donnie's ghoulish discussions about their future inheritance. Another from Margaret, my neighbor, who described our weekly Scrabble games, my active gardening, and my sharp, engaged mind. She detailed my clear-headed explanation of why I was installing new locks and cameras. She described a woman who was a good friend and a competent, independent neighbor, not the isolated recluse the petition alleged. We gathered my life. We documented my routines. We compiled evidence of my independence, my judgment, my sanity. While their case was a flimsy structure built of innuendo and gossip, ours was a fortress of stone, built of expert testimony, professional observation, and the sworn truth of the people who truly knew me. As the court date approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. I looked at the file Andrew had prepared for me, our counter-petition. It was thick with documents. Dr. Morales's sterling evaluation, the bank manager's testimony, the loving, truthful words of my sister and my friend, the official letter from APS closing their case. Their petition was an attempt to erase me, to define me by a narrative of their own malicious creation. But our response, this thick, heavy file of truth, was my reclamation. It was the story of my awakening. It was the evidence not of my confusion, but of my clarity. They had ambushed me with a legal filing designed to break my spirit. But they didn't realize that in doing so, they had given me the one thing I needed most. A public stage upon which to finally, and decisively, tell the truth. The courtroom would not be my execution chamber. It would be my theater of liberation. The probate courtroom was a place of suffocating quiet and cheap wood paneling. It smelled of old paper and stale air, the official scent of lives being dismantled and rearranged by decree. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, monotonous drone, casting a flat, unforgiving light on everything. It was a room designed to strip away emotion, to reduce the messy, painful complexities of human relationships to the dry, sterile language of legal argument. I sat beside Andrew at our designated table, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I was wearing my armor, the navy blazer, the crisp white blouse. My new, sharp haircut framed a face that felt like a mask of serene composure. Inside, my heart was a slow, heavy drum, beating out a rhythm of dread and determination. Across the narrow aisle, at the petitioner's table, sat my son and his wife. Mark was staring down at his hands, his shoulders slumped, the picture of a man being dragged along by a current too strong for him to fight. He looked pale and diminished under the harsh courtroom lights. Donnie, however, was a study in coiled, righteous indignation. She sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on her lawyer, a slick, self-assured man named Arthur Davies, the same silver-haired vulture who had invaded my home. She would occasionally shoot a venomous, sidelong glance in my direction, her expression a toxic cocktail of fury and contempt. She did not look like a concerned daughter. She looked like a thwarted heiress. The judge, a man named Harrison with a weary, intelligent face and a fringe of gray hair, entered the room, and we all rose. He settled into his high-backed chair, the focal point of the entire room, and surveyed the scene before him. His eyes, I noted, missed nothing. He looked from their table to ours, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Mr. Davies began. His voice was a smooth, sonorous melody, filling the quiet room with a performance of deep, sorrowful concern. He painted a masterful, tragic portrait of a beloved matriarch succumbing to the ravages of age. He spoke of my, once sharp mind now clouded by paranoia and confusion. He described a woman who had become dangerously isolated, prey to the manipulations of outsiders who sought to alienate her from her loving, devoted family. He held up the statements from my cranky neighbor and the duped pharmacist as if they were holy scripture, proof of my unraveling. Your Honor, he concluded, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity, my clients, Mark and Danielle Gardner, are not here to take anything from Mrs. Brooks. They are here to protect her from herself, and from those who would take advantage of her vulnerable state. They are here out of love. The word love hung in the sterile air, a grotesque and obscene lie. I felt a hot flash of rage, but I held my composure, my expression unchanged. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge. Then it was Andrew's turn. He did not rise with the theatrical flourish of Mr. Davies. He stood, walked to the lectern, and placed a single, thick binder on its surface. He did not begin with emotion. He began with facts. Your Honor, he said, his voice a calm, clear counterpoint to the cloying sentimentality of his opponent. The petitioners would have you believe this is a case about love and concern. It is not. This is a case about money and control. And the evidence will show that the only manipulation and advantage-taking has been on the part of the petitioners themselves, for a period of no less than 3 years. Gone. Andrew began to systematically dismantle their narrative, piece by painful piece. He started with the wedding. Mr. Gardner, he said, calling my son to the stand. Mark shuffled forward, avoiding my gaze, and was sworn in. Mr. Gardner, Andrew began, his tone deceptively gentle. You were married recently, is that correct? Yes, Mark mumbled. A happy occasion, I'm sure. Your mother, however, was not invited. Why is that? Mark squirmed. We wanted to keep it small. Just special guests. Special guests, Andrew repeated, letting the words echo in the silent room. And your mother, the woman who raised you, the woman who, by our calculations, had given you and your wife over $40,000 in the preceding 3 years, she was not considered special enough to attend? Davies shot to his feet. Objection? Relevance? It speaks directly to the nature of the relationship, Your Honor, Andrew said calmly. It establishes a pattern of exclusion that is inconsistent with the petitioner's claims of a close, loving, and concerned family dynamic. Overruled, the judge said, his eyes fixed on my son. Answer the question, Mr. Gardner. Mark stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. He looked helplessly at Donnie, whose expression had turned to stone. The image of a loving, concerned son was already beginning to crack. Andrew was relentless. He cross-examined Mark about the rent, the furniture, the car I had co-signed for. With each question, the picture became clearer, not of a family helping their matriarch, but of 2 able-bodied adults systematically draining the resources of an elderly parent. Next, Andrew called Dr. Finch, their hired psychiatrist. On direct examination by Davies, she was formidable, speaking in a torrent of clinical jargon about my paranoid ideation and refusal of care, citing my decision not to let her into my home as prime evidence. But on cross-examination, Andrew took out his scalpel. Dr. Finch, he began, you have testified that Mrs. Brooks's refusal to be evaluated by you is a sign of her incompetence. Is that correct? It is a strong indicator of paranoia, yes, she said confidently. And you were retained and paid by the petitioners in this case, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner? Yes, that is correct. So, a complete stranger, hired by the very people who stand to gain financially from having her declared incompetent, shows up on her doorstep unannounced, demanding to perform a psychiatric evaluation. And you find her refusal to immediately submit to be a sign of paranoia? Andrew asked, a note of incredulity in his voice. Doctor, would you let me into your house under those circumstances? The doctor flushed. That's a different situation. Is it? Andrew pressed. Or is it that Mrs. Brooks was, in fact, exhibiting excellent judgment and a strong instinct for self-preservation? Is it not possible that her refusal was the most rational and competent response she could have had? He had turned their own expert's testimony against them, reframing my supposed paranoia as sound judgment. The foundation of their case was beginning to crumble. Finally, it was my turn to take the stand. My legs felt strangely light as I walked to the witness box, but my mind was a block of ice. I swore the oath, my voice clear and steady. Andrew began his questions, and I told my story. I was not emotional, I was factual. I laid out the timeline of events, the financial drain, the broken promises, the casual cruelty of the special guest's text message. Mrs. Brooks, Andrew said, his voice gentle. Your son and daughter-in-law claim their petition is motivated by love. How would you describe your relationship with them over the last 3 years? I paused, gathering my thoughts. I looked at the judge, and for the first time, I allowed a flicker of the deep, profound hurt to show in my eyes. Your Honor, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still room. I love my son, I will always love the boy I raised, but the relationship I have had with him and his wife for the past 3 years was not one of love. It was a transaction. It was an arrangement of transactional dependence, dressed up to look like a family. I provided the funds, and they provided the occasional, brief illusion of affection. The moment I stopped providing the funds, the illusion shattered, and they began this process to try and take it by force. Then came the cross-examination from Mr. Davies. He came at me with everything he had, trying to twist my words, to portray me as a bitter, vengeful old woman being manipulated by my new lawyer. Mrs. Brooks, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Isn't it true that all these actions changing the locks, hiring Mr. Harris, cutting off your son only began after this minor misunderstanding about the wedding? There was no misunderstanding, I replied, my voice firm. There was a moment of perfect, painful clarity. The wedding was not the cause, it was the catalyst. It was the event that finally forced me to see the truth of a situation I had been denying for years. And you expect the court to believe you are fully competent, yet you allowed this supposed exploitation to go on for 3 years? He sneered. I looked him directly in the eye. Mr. Davies, I said, being too trusting is not a sign of incompetence. Believing in the best of your only child, even when the evidence suggests otherwise, is not a sign of dementia. It is, perhaps, a sign of a mother's foolish heart, but it is not a legal basis for stripping a woman of her fundamental human rights. The courtroom was silent. I had not been flustered. I had not been confused. I had met his attack with a truth that was more powerful than any of his legal maneuvering. After I stepped down, Andrew presented our final pieces of evidence, the glowing report from Dr. Morales, the sworn testimony from Carl Benson, Denise, and Margaret, and the official, case-closed letter from Adult Protective Services. He built a wall of evidence so high and so solid that their flimsy case simply disintegrated against it. Judge Harrison listened to the closing arguments, his face unreadable. When the lawyers were finished, he did not recess. He sat for a long moment, looking at the file before him. He looked at Mark and Donnie. Then he looked at me. The purpose of a guardianship is to protect the vulnerable, he began, his voice a low, serious rumble that commanded the absolute attention of the room. It is a profound legal step, one that removes an individual's most basic right to self-determination. It is not a tool to be used to resolve family disputes or to expedite an inheritance. He looked directly at my son and his wife. The evidence presented by the petitioners is flimsy at best, consisting of hearsay and misinterpretations. The evidence presented by the respondent, on the other hand, is overwhelming. It includes expert medical testimony of her superior cognitive function, sworn statements from credible witnesses, and a documented history of what appears to be a concerted effort by the petitioners to gain financial control. He picked up the petition and held it up. This court finds that the respondent, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, is a highly competent, intelligent, and capable individual. She is in no need of the court's protection. To the contrary, it seems she has done an admirable job of protecting herself. He looked directly at me then, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like respect in his eyes. The petition for guardianship and conservatorship is denied. He banged his gavel. The sound was a thunderclap in the silent room. A single, sharp, final crack that signified the end of the war. It was over. I had won. The sound of the gavel was a physical force. It was a shockwave that rolled through the silent courtroom, shattering the suffocating tension that had held us all captive. For a split second, no one moved. Then, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the room. I felt Andrew's hand on my shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "We did it, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice thick with a triumphant relief that mirrored my own. I looked over at the petitioner's table. The aftermath of their defeat was a study in contrasts. Mark had slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut, his face buried in his hands. He was a portrait of utter, pathetic collapse. Donnie, however, was incandescent with rage. Her face was a mottled, furious red, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. She shot a look at me, a glare of pure, undiluted hatred that was more honest than any of the false affection she had ever shown me. It was the impotent fury of a tyrant whose power has just been stripped away. Her lawyer, Mr. Davies, was already stuffing papers into his briefcase with the brisk, detached air of a mercenary whose job was done, win or lose. The check, I was sure, had already cleared. I did not gloat. I did not even smile. I simply stood, my legs feeling surprisingly steady, and allowed Andrew to guide me out of the courtroom. The moment the heavy doors closed behind us, cutting off the toxic atmosphere of the room, the composure I had maintained for hours finally began to crack. A deep, shuddering breath escaped me, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "It's over," I whispered, the words feeling foreign and impossibly sweet on my tongue. "It's really over." Quote. "It's over," Andrew confirmed, his professional demeanor softening into a warm, genuine smile. "They have no grounds for appeal. You are free, Evelyn, completely and utterly free." Waiting for us in the wide, marbled hallway were the architects of my victory, the true members of my special guests list. My sister, Denise, rushed forward and wrapped me in a fierce, protective hug that smelled of her familiar perfume and unspoken love. Margaret was there, her calm, steady presence a reassuring anchor. And even Carl Benson, my former bank manager, had come, a quiet gesture of solidarity that touched me more than he could know. They had all sat in the back of the courtroom, a silent, supportive phalanx, and their presence had been a shield. "You were magnificent, Ev," Denise said, her own eyes shining with tears. "Absolutely magnificent. We're so proud of you, Evelyn," Margaret added, squeezing my arm. Their faces, alight with genuine joy for me, were a stark, beautiful contrast to the venomous glare Donnie had given me. This, I realized with a sudden, profound clarity, was what family looked like. Not a relationship built on obligation and financial dependence, but a bond forged in mutual respect, loyalty, and unwavering support. It was not a codependent knot, but a community. That evening, we did not go home to lick our wounds. We went out to celebrate. Andrew begged off, citing other clients, but the rest of us, my new, true family, went to a lovely little Italian restaurant in German Village. It was a place with checkered tablecloths, candles flickering in Chianti bottles, and the warm, delicious scent of garlic and baking bread. It was a place of life. We sat around a big, round table, and the conversation was loud and filled with laughter. We toasted with glasses of red wine to justice, to freedom, to the future. I looked around the table at these people who had rallied to my side. Denise, my fiery, loyal sister who had been my emotional bedrock. Margaret, my wise and steady neighbor who had taught me the power of a well-placed boundary. Carl, a man who had done his job with integrity and then had gone a step beyond, showing up as a friend. For the first time in years, I felt completely, utterly myself. I was not Mark's mother, the ever-giving, ever-forgiving ATM. I was not Danny's adversary, a problem to be managed. I was Evelyn Brooks, a woman surrounded by friends, her own person, with a life that was once again hers to design. We talked for hours, and not once did we mention the names Mark or Danny. They were ghosts from a past that had been legally and emotionally exorcised. Their power was gone. The victory in the courtroom was not an ending, it was a beginning. It had not just saved me from a terrible fate, it had liberated me to create a new one. The days that followed were filled with a sense of exhilarating purpose. The house, my fortress, had served its purpose. It had protected me during the war, but I realized now that it was also a museum of my old life, its walls saturated with the ghosts of my foolish generosity and their cloying entitlement. It was time to move on. With a clarity that surprised even me, I called a real estate agent. I put the house that had been the subject of their ghoulish inheritance fantasies on the market. It sold in a week, for a price that made my eyes water. The weight of that mortgage, that yard, those memories, was lifted from my shoulders in a single, clean transaction. I didn't buy another house. The thought of being tied down to another piece of property felt suffocating. Instead, I found a beautiful, sunny apartment downtown, in a modern building overlooking the Scioto Mile, with a balcony that had a perfect view of the city skyline. It was smaller, sleeker, and utterly, completely mine. It was a space with no history, no ghosts, just a blank canvas waiting for me to paint the next chapter of my life. My first act in my new home was to sit down with a new estate planner, one recommended by Andrew. The last vestiges of my old life, my old obligations, were legally and finally swept away. I structured my new will with a clear head and a free heart. A significant portion was left to Denise and her children. Smaller, meaningful bequests were made to Margaret and a few old friends, but the largest portion, the bulk of the assets they had fought so viciously to control, I designated for a collection of charities I had researched meticulously, nonprofits dedicated to providing legal aid and support for victims of elder abuse. The thought of it made me smile. The money they had coveted, the money they had tried to steal, would now be used to fund the very legal battles that would stop people just like them. It was not revenge. It was poetic justice. My pain would be repurposed to protect others. My story would become a shield. And then, with my legal and financial affairs in perfect, fortified order, I began to live. Really, truly live, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The future was no longer a threat to be defended against, but an open road to be explored. I took a portion of the proceeds from the sale of the house and I bought a ticket for a 2-week trip to the coast of Maine, the trip Richard and I had always dreamed of. I went by myself, and it was glorious. I ate lobster rolls by the ocean, I hiked in Acadia National Park, I spent hours just watching the waves crash against the rocky shore. I was not lonely. I was in good company, my own. When I returned, I signed up for a watercolor class at the local arts center, a long-dormant passion I had never made time for. My first paintings were clumsy and amateurish, but they were filled with color and light, and they were mine. I started volunteering at the library, the same one that had been my sanctuary, reading stories to children on Saturday mornings. Their small, upturned faces, full of innocent wonder, were a potent antidote to the years I had spent staring into the face of cynical greed. My life became a tapestry woven from these small, deliberate acts of joy and purpose. My community of friends grew. I reconnected with old acquaintances I had neglected, finding that the world was full of good, kind people, if you only had the space in your life to let them in. My days were full, not with manufactured crises and draining obligations, but with art, and books, and laughter, and the simple, profound peace of a life lived on my own terms. I had not just reclaimed my tomorrows, I was actively, joyfully creating them. The city lights from my balcony looked like a scattering of diamonds on black velvet. The air was cool and crisp with the promise of autumn, and the low hum of the downtown traffic was a soothing, anonymous lullaby. This view, this peace, was the spoils of a war I never wanted to fight. From my new perch, 12 stories above the ground, the small, quiet suburban street where I had lived for 40 years seemed a world away, a lifetime ago. I rarely thought of them anymore. Mark and Donnie. Their names, which had once been the axis around which my entire world revolved, were now just faint echoes, like the memory of a long-ago illness. They had no power here, in this clean, bright space that I had chosen for myself. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, a piece of news would filter through to me, passed along reluctantly by my sister Denise, who still heard whispers through the family grapevine. The latest whisper was that they had downsized. Drastically. The perfect apartment I had furnished, the one whose rent I had paid for 3 years, had been far beyond their means once the Bank of Mom had officially and permanently closed. Word was they were now living in a small, cramped duplex on the far side of town, the kind of place they would have turned their noses up at in their heyday. Donnie, Denise had heard, had taken her first steady, full-time job in years, working as a receptionist at a dental office. The designer handbags and spa days were a thing of the past. The easy, comfortable life they felt so entitled to had evaporated the moment they were forced to pay for it themselves. I felt a brief, fleeting flicker of something, not pity, not anymore. And not satisfaction, either. Not exactly, it was more a sense of cosmic correctness. A rebalancing of the scales. They had not been punished by some external force. They were simply living with the natural, inevitable consequences of their own choices. Their gilded cage had been built on a foundation of my generosity. When the foundation was removed, the cage simply collapsed. From my balcony, suspended between the dark earth and the star-dusted sky, I finally recognized the fundamental, unalterable truth that had taken me 70 years to learn. Real love, true connection, has no price tag. It is not something that can be bought with rent checks or pacified with expensive furniture. It cannot be coerced with guilt or legislated in a courtroom. It is a gift, freely and mutually given. Anything else, anything that comes with a balance sheet of obligations and expectations, is just a transaction. A business arrangement masquerading as a family. I had spent years trying to purchase my son's affection, to secure my place in his life through a relentless campaign of financial support. I thought I was being a good mother. I saw now that I had been a poor businesswoman, making a series of bad investments in a failing enterprise, refusing to see the red flags, refusing to cut my losses until the company had declared war on me. Its sole investor. My new life was built on a different philosophy. My friendships with Margaret and my sister were not based on what we could do for each other, but on who we were. We gave each other our time, our laughter, our counsel, our company, gifts that had no monetary value but were, in fact, priceless. The children at the library didn't love me because I might one day leave them an inheritance. They loved me because I knew how to do the silly voice for the wolf in The 3 Little Pigs. The joy I found in the vibrant swirl of watercolors on paper was not something that could be quantified or appraised. It was a private, personal dividend, paid directly to my soul. I traced the arc of my journey, the painful but necessary metamorphosis I had endured. It was a simple, 4-step progression, a creed I now understood was the secret to my own liberation. First came the hurt. The raw, agonizing wound of that first phone call, the gut punch of the wedding photos. The pain had been a necessary fire, burning away the dense fog of denial I had been living in for years. It had to hurt that badly for me to finally open my eyes. Then came the awakening. The slow, dawning horror as I counted the cost, not just in dollars, but in dignity. The realization that I was not a beloved mother, but an invisible ATM. This was the moment of clarity, the point of no return where the comforting lies were finally replaced by the cold, hard truth. Next, the pushback. This was the most crucial, and the most difficult, step. The first, no. The call to the bank. The hiring of a lawyer, the changing of the locks. It was the series of deliberate, terrifying acts of self-preservation. It was the decision to stop being a victim and to start being a fighter. It was the moment I stopped absorbing their attacks and started building a fortress. And finally, freedom. This was the peace I felt now, standing on my balcony. It was the quiet joy of a Saturday morning spent reading, with no phone calls to dread. It was the laughter shared with friends over a game of Scrabble. It was the profound, unshakable security that comes from knowing you can protect yourself, that you are the sole and sovereign ruler of your own life. Hurt had led to awakening, which had necessitated the pushback, which had, at last, resulted in my freedom. A text message pinged on my phone, which was resting on the small table beside me. A few years ago, that sound would have sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Now, I smiled. It was Margaret, from next door in my old neighborhood. She was officially moving into my building next month, into an apartment 2 floors down. Scrabble rematch next Tuesday, her message read. I'm bringing the wine this time. I typed back a reply. You're on. Prepare to be defeated. I thought of my son, Mark, for a moment. Not with anger, but with a kind of distant, clinical sorrow. He had made his choice. He had chosen his wife's greed over his mother's love. He had stood by, a silent, passive accomplice, as she had plotted my erasure. Perhaps one day, when he was older, he would understand the true cost of what he had lost. But his awakening would have to be his own. It was no longer my responsibility to manage his life, his finances, or his conscience. I had finally accepted the hardest lesson a parent can learn. You cannot save your children from themselves. You can only save yourself. I took one last look at the glittering cityscape, at the endless river of headlights flowing along the freeway below. So many people, all moving, all heading somewhere, each with their own story, their own battles, their own quiet victories. They had tried to make my world small, to confine me to the role of the confused, helpless old woman. But in fighting back, my world had become larger, richer, and more beautiful than I had ever imagined. I stepped back inside, sliding the glass door shut, closing out the cool night air. The apartment was warm and quiet, filled with my books, my paintings, my life. I was not the woman they had described in that courtroom. I was not the person they had tried to create. I knew, now, exactly who I was. I'm Evelyn Brooks, I whispered into the quiet of my new home, a final, simple declaration to myself. I'm 70 years old. And the person I must love and protect first, is me. And for the first time in my entire life, I truly, completely, believed it. This story is a vital reminder that true family is built on respect, not obligation. For anyone who feels like an invisible ATM, whose love is measured in transactions, know this. Your worth is not defined by your utility to others. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Hurt can be a powerful catalyst for awakening, and the quietest voice can learn to say the most powerful word, no. True freedom begins the moment you decide that the person you must love and protect first is yourself. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.